The most dominant team in F1 through the turbo hybrid era has started this season poorly once again, as the Mercedes team struggled to bridge the gap to the new top team in the sport. So how has it gone so wrong for Mercedes in 2023, and can they really recover to fight for this championship? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The Mercedes meltdown. It's safe to say that the 2022 season was a failure for Mercedes. The team has grown used to being the benchmark of Formula One over the last decade. The 2022 season began with the team revealing a radical concept in the side pod area, where the team had shrunk that area of the car to become as small as possible. This was vastly different to some other teams like Ferrari, a team that opted to use the wide side pods in their new design. The Mercedes team had a tough time in 2022. They were the third fastest team through the majority of the season, and it was only through the second half of the year that their reliability meant that they were starting to compete more often with Ferrari. The team opted to stick with their unique design for 2023 as they kept their zero side pod concept. The reason the team stuck with this design was the fact that they won the penultimate race of 2022 with George Russell in Brazil, a sign that they interpreted as the team's development heading in the right direction. This momentum did suggest that the team could enter 2023 with the prospect of competing with Ferrari and maybe even bridging the gap to the Red Bull team at the front. For me, the team's approach to amending their car last season was very interesting. For the first time in almost a decade, the team was under a significant amount of pressure and well behind their rivals. They were no longer competing each weekend for race wins and arguably had the worst porpoising of all the cars on the grid. The team's issues early on in the year were compounded by the fact that they had fewer wind tunnel runs and CFD testing time, having won the 2021 Constructors' Championship. But even then, the car's design on the surface didn't drastically change through the year as they tried to tackle the porpoising issue that plagued them throughout the early part of the season. The fundamental issue for Mercedes was the fact that they'd designed their car to operate as low to the track surface as possible. They wanted to ensure that they could seal the car to the tarmac to ensure they could maximise the ground effect from the new Venturi tunnels. Meanwhile, Red Bull's concept allowed them to generate significant downforce even when running the car at a higher ride height. This allowed them to run at higher speeds without the porpoising issues. And when the Mercedes car was adjusted to run at a higher ride height to remove the porpoising, they had less downforce and couldn't compete, which resulted in the car needing to be finely balanced to compete every single weekend. This year, Mercedes have reportedly hit their targets, and yet they remain well behind the top team in the sport. The amendments to the regulations that were introduced this year to increase the floor edge heights seems to have impacted Mercedes, and they have a car that doesn't have the same amount of downforce as their rivals. To top it off, the team are also at a disadvantage when it comes to straight line speed. The Red Bull has a significant advantage in that department as well, especially when they have DRS open. It was evident in Saudi Arabia and in Australia that nobody can match the Red Bull with the DRS wide open. So overall, the Mercedes is at a disadvantage in several areas, and they've seemingly fallen back. But there are signs of a potentially rapid recovery 3 races into the season, and to hear more about those signs throughout 2023, be sure to subscribe to Behind the Drive for more. The signs of a recovery. The Mercedes performance in Bahrain was disappointing, as they were comfortably beaten by the Aston Martin team, which is a setup that uses their engines and uses many of the same elements at the rear end. The Mercedes car was far harder on the tyres than Aston Martin, but in Jeddah and in Australia they seemed like they had more of a chance when it came to competing with their rivals. In Saudi Arabia there were signs of improvements. Both Mercedes cars were ahead of Lance Stroll, but they were still behind the Aston Martin of Alonso. This was a sign that Mercedes had gained a better understanding of their car already, and they also benefited from a circuit that was better suited to their car more than the one in Bahrain. And then in Australia there was another step forward for Mercedes. The team managed to be the second fastest team, taking second and third in qualifying, and then their launch off the line was incredible. Their car clearly has an ability to heat up the tyres better than the Red Bull, or at least it did when it came to the conditions at Albert Park. But through the race itself, there were still signs that the Aston Martin was better in terms of tyre wear in the hands of Fernando Alonso, as Hamilton was under a significant amount of pressure from the Spaniard. In the end, Mercedes finished ahead of Alonso for the first time this year, and actually took a second place finish. A solid achievement given how far behind they were earlier in the season. So what's changed for Mercedes? Well, the team has started to figure out where their optimum operating window is with the W14. It seems they've found this sooner than they did last year, but it's still a very fine margin for the drivers to feel comfortable in the car. The new challenge for Mercedes is the fact that the drivers had differing feelings through the weekend in Australia. Hamilton has often ended practice sessions feeling like the team had gone the wrong way with the setup. He's been complaining about not feeling connected to the car up to this point in the season. But Russell, after Australia FP2, felt the team had made the right call on the setup, which was giving him more confidence. This is a challenge that Mercedes need to manage. Unlike many other top teams, they have two drivers that, if given the opportunity, will fight tooth and nail for the championship. This has been made more complex by the fact that Russell beat the seven-time champion over the course of the 2022 season. So far this year, Russell has outqualified Hamilton at every race, and while he's been behind in the drivers' standings, there are reliability factors that have impacted that position. Meanwhile, back at the factory, the Mercedes team are positive about the improvements that they're seeing from the change in direction that they decided to make after Bahrain. Toto Wolff has commented that the team are seeing larger gains in their testing runs than they had down in their current development path. These optimistic comments suggest that the team may well be able to improve rapidly through this season. They've been focused on that setup window that I mentioned earlier, giving them a wider operating window to be faster at more circuits. This change in approach could bring gains, but it will take time to bed those changes in. Whenever teams bring upgrades during the season, they have to test them on track to ensure the data correlates from their testing into real life, and then they begin the process of adjusting the setup to find the optimal window. Last season, Aston Martin introduced a major change mid-year, and it took them several races to get the setup right and reap the benefits of those changes. Even Mercedes showed this in 2021 as their final upgrade arrived at Silverstone, but the team continued to show improvements in their pace late on into the season. This will be something that the team will be aware of and may well be the factor that prevents them from mounting a real challenge to Red Bull this year. A championship contender. Realistically, this year nobody will be able to catch the Red Bull team. Ferrari, Aston Martin and Mercedes are all a big step behind their rivals. But for me, I think it's Mercedes that stands the best chance of catching up to Red Bull this year. If there was one team that could win a race outside of the Red Bull setup, it would be the Silver Arrows in my view. They seem to have made big steps already, and if they can convert these positive signs into lap time, they may well be able to challenge the top team eventually. The change from Bahrain to Australia for Mercedes has been massive. They seem to be making the most of their car and finding what they can from it despite the limited operating window. This has resulted in them being the first team outside of the Red Bull to take a top 2 finish this season, and I think they could well continue with this trajectory once their upgrades arrive later this year. Not only this, but Mercedes do have two drivers that are capable of capitalising on the car. It may well be challenging to get a setup that suits them both, but if they find that, then they could well be strong once again. Though, their relationship will be fascinating to watch through this year if these differences in opinion continue. It'll be very difficult for Mercedes to challenge for this title, but last season their second half was stronger than Ferrari, the team that ended up second in that championship. This year we may find that their second half of the season shows a large step away from the rest of the chasing pack, placing them closer to Red Bull, and so I expect Mercedes will take a big step this year, but not quite enough to be title contenders.